All right, hello and welcome for a podcast episode here for Age Civil War on this going to be a new format. We're going to try out and see how this works out. Instead of the written interviews, we're going to do a conversation. And for my first interview, I am joined by Frank Cirillo, who is a graduate of the University of Virginia, where he looked in his dissertation at the abolitionist movement. And we are going to talk today about the abolitionists with regard to his new book that came out in November of 2023, The Abolitionist Civil War, Immediatist, and the Struggle to Transform the Union. He has been in a lot of different places, including Yale University, a postdoctoral fellow at New York Historical Society. He had spent a year in Bonn, and he will be a postdoc at the University of Michigan in the coming year. Thank you so much for joining us today, Frank, and congratulations on your book.
Thanks for having me, Niels. I'm happy to be here.
Great pleasure. So, Frank, tell us a little bit about how did you come to, first of all, write a dissertation about the abolitionist, and then to turn that dissertation into a book?
And so it all came about originally with my master's thesis. I went to graduate school at the University of Virginia, where most things are Thomas Jefferson all the time, every time. So I thought
Sure.
there would be an interesting approach to talking about Jefferson would be looking at Jefferson in memory, specifically anti-slavery memory, how anti-slavery reformers talked about Jefferson in, the antebellum and Civil War years. And as I got into that, I found myself less interested in the Jefferson aspect and more interested in the abolitionists themselves. I thought, they're really interesting, and there's actually kind of a big hole in the scholarship here. There's a lot done on abolitionists, in their antebellum years, 1830s, 40s, and 50s, but kind of leaves off at the Civil War itself. And I thought there's a gap that I can fill here. So that did become the basis of my dissertation, which was published in 2017. Uh, and, like most people do, I spent a fair amount of time revising it, doing additional research, found a whole slew of really interesting materials at the Library of Congress, the New York Historical Society, and elsewhere to kind of burnish my findings and dig a little deeper. And yeah, that became the book.
Wow. Yeah, and like that's a fascinating kind of direction that you saying like, oh, let's look at abolitionist memory, which I think is a perfect topic too, which really we need more
Yeah.
work on as well. But then you end up with this hole, and you're like, oh, that's something else I need to fill. So let's get one of the formalities of sort of these interviews out of our way. And what is the argument that you have in your book? What's sort of the punchline of your book?
Yeah. So I'll get into the definitions of, what I mean about abolitionists and other things later, but just in terms of what the basic argument is, I look at the transformation of the abolitionist movement during the years of the American Civil War, so 1861 to 1865, and how the movement had a momentous effect on both, the nation at large and on abolitionism itself. So I look at how these abolitionists, these anti-slavery reformers, really overhauled, really transformed entirely their core beings, their very identities to intervene in the war and become these political actors in the Union war effort. And by doing so, they really helped transform the Union War into a war for freedom, into a war for emancipation. But they only at the cost, at the consequence of really shattering and weakening their ability to achieve and secure post-emancipation Black rights. So the way I sum it up is that abolitionist actions help explain how the Union War achieved both so little and so
Mm.
much in terms of justice for African Americans.
And that was one of the aspects that was really fascinating about your book, just sort of in general, is that we always think of the abolitionists as sort of like it's a success story, right? Like 13th
Mhm.
Amendment, Emancipation Proclamation, and you're kind of complicating and saying like, yes, but um, why have we never thought about this? Why are we so tempted always to kind of just like, we have all this conversation and criticism in the US of like, oh, historians always do the dark side and the bad stuff. And like when it comes to abolition, we always talked about the good side and only the good side, it seems. Like you're kind of really
I
correcting
think
that.
I'm I'm trying to. I think part of it is historians like the Dunning School were so anti-abolitionist for so long that it just we needed to remind everyone that they actually were not the bad guys in the
Yeah.
story. So just presenting them as these unadulterated heroes kind of made sense as a reaction against that. But I
Mm,
think it's also partly a product of, again, this book doesn't talk about abolitionist memory, but it is kind of a passion project of mine to look at that stuff after the war. They all wrote memoirs talking about how they were the heroes in anti-slavery struggle, and it really caught on with this. The people who were fighting for civil rights, the people who were opposing segregation, looked up to the abolitionists as heroes. So I think that their narrative was perpetuated and carried on into our present day. And I mean, I don't mean to say that they didn't accomplish a great deal. They did, but
mm.
there was a cost and a consequence of that, and they were flawed because they were human beings like all of us. There were consequences to what they did.
Sure. So let's talk about abolitionists and so it seems like we have a couple of different groups that we're looking at because your title suggests we're looking at the immediate abolitionists. So that's your Garrisonian group primarily, but then you also divides that further into what you call moral purists and interventionists. And then you like have new layers in the middle of the war all of a sudden that these groups break further apart. So
Yeah.
let's stay with abolitionists and sort of the initial groups, the kind of moral purists and interventionists. How do you define all of these
Yeah.
guys?
So I'll start off by defining what an abolitionist is. So in my book, I talk about immediate abolitionist, and immediatist interchangeably. All it means is they're immediate abolitionists as opposed to gradual abolitionists who were around in the decades before.
Mhm,
So that is, I'll talk about the traditional factions, Garrison and the people opposed to Garrison. But just for how I define the abolitionists, they're generally, James McPherson and his really seminal work on abolitionists during the war years from the 1960s uses really three main criteria for how to define abolitionists.
mhm,
And I believe in all of them. One, they believed in immediate emancipation. So emancipation has to end now and unconditionally as opposed to gradually sometime in the future. They believed in some form of rights for African Americans.
mhm,
Now, that meant a wide variety of things. For some people, it meant full political and socioeconomic equality. For some people, it just meant former slaves would just stay on their plantations and labor for nominal wages. They would be free, but not free to move around. But the fact that there was some place for African Americans in the post-emancipation United States distinguished them from people who believed in colonization and just
mhm,
sending African Americans away after freedom. And abolitionists were not part of mainstream political parties. So
mhm,
I draw the line. It's distinguishing abolitionists from people like radical Republicans, like Charles
mhm,
Sumner, Thaddeus Stevens. These people believed in Black rights, they believed in immediate emancipation, but they were part of a mainstream political party with a
mhm,
moderate center of mass. They had to hew to the party line and not advocate these beliefs a lot of the time. Whereas abolitionists said, no, we are not part of these mainstream parties. We are above the fray and we don't pollute ourselves that way. So those are the three typical definitions. I add a fourth. They believed in that the current union was imperfect,
mhm,
was corrupted, and it was their job to make it a morally transformed union, to make it perfect and make it a beacon of
mhm.
democracy. We'll talk more about that a little later. So
Yeah,
the
there's a lot of
traditional
things we
faction,
want to talk about because
yes,
there's so much in your
absolutely,
book.
it's
Yeah.
it is a lot. I agree. Uh, So the traditional factions that we talk about in the scholarship, which are mostly the antebellum factions before the war, you've got your Garrisonians and your non-Garrisonians. Again, all of them are immediate abolitionists, immediatists. The main difference is over the Constitution. The Garrisonians believed the Constitution was pro-slavery, and they
Mhm.
wanted disunion, temporary disunion, so that essentially the South would be bereft, would lose the protections of the federal slave code, and slavery would somehow end. And then
Mhm.
the nation would reunite on an anti-slavery basis. Again, very idealistic, not very, practical. But their point was we want to, they don't want a permanent sundering of the nation. They want to redeem the Union and make it good and anti-slavery. Um, that's people like William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Parker Pillsbury, and the non-Garrisonians like Frederick Douglass is the most famous example of that. Believe the Constitution was anti-slavery, that you could work within the current political system, and that you shouldn't be part of a mainstream party, but you could create your own pure anti-slavery party to achieve change within the current system. So these are the traditional factions, and they were the defining lines of abolitionism from its founding in the early 1830s into the late 1850s. But things started to change in the late 1850s. Abolitionists started to get really frustrated because they're just seeing victory after victory for the slave power, right? They've been fighting for almost 30 years, and it doesn't seem like they're winning. It seems like they're losing. From the
They're
compromise of
frustrated,
1850,
right?
Kansas, Nebraska, yeah, Dred Scott, they're really really frustrated, and they feel like they've failed. Their old tactics of just, using, purity, standing aloof, and trying to appeal to the people with these high-minded moral appeals is not
Won't
working.
work.
So
Mm-mm.
a lot of these abolitionists, both Garrisonians and non-Garrisonians, the biggest names are people from both factions. So William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips from the Garrisonians, also Frederick Douglass from the non-Garrisonians, a major rival of Garrison. They start to say, well, maybe instead of just, sticking to using pure moral means to achieve our moral ends, maybe we have to use whatever instruments we have at hand to achieve change however we
Mhm.
can. So, and one of those instruments by the late 1850s was the Republican Party,
Mhm.
which was not an abolitionist party. It was moderately anti-slavery. It wanted to stop
Mhm.
the expansion of slavery, not to end slavery itself. But they thought maybe these Republicans will be useful in our
Mhm.
fights. So maybe we can kind of have very tentative and very, low key, but some kind of engagement with them, and not just totally shun them. So these people are what I call the interventionists. They're most
Mhm.
abolitionists. And then there's a small group of abolitionists, and these are mostly like the hardline, most left-wing Garrisonians. So Parker Pillsbury and his close friend Abby Kelly Foster, these are who I call moral purists. And they said, no, we should not abandon the old ways because we still believe that moral ends require moral means. If you compromise, if you engage, try to use imperfect means to your moral ends, first off, you won't succeed because perfection requires perfect means. You'll just fail, but also all you'll do is corrupt yourself in the process. You'll lose yourself, you'll lose sight of some of your goals, and you'll destroy the movement. So this
Mhm.
became gradually replaced the not at first, not totally. There were the people, Garrisonians and Garrisonians, there were a lot, and Garrisonians and non-Garrisonians had a lot of personal gripes against each other. So it didn't disappear immediately once the war started, but this my book talks about how this new dividing line between interventionists and moral purists gradually replaced that. So pretty much by the fall of 1861, that was the dividing line among
Mhm.
abolitionists. It didn't really matter, honestly, if you were a Garrisonian or non-Garrisonian a year earlier.
Right. It's like it's a totally new world that you
Mhm.
all of a sudden have there. Um, I, as you were talking, I want to get to sort of historiographical questions in a second, but as you were talking, it also seemed like there's sort of that frustration, obviously, by the late 1850s. Like you have been agitating for emancipation for, in Garrison's case, 25 years, and it doesn't seem to matter. No one pays much attention to you. They all think you're crazy. Um, And then there's this like the Declaration of Sentiments, and you have all these like goals that they're debating of like even like women's rights, of should we like Caddy Stanton, should we like expand the struggle for freedom for like with regard to gender? And I kind of wondered as you were talking of like how much are we engaging and are abolitionists engaging in these debates because precisely they are not in power and they are not involved politically, so they don't have like these pressures politicians have to kind of think about a re-election, of satisfying different parts of their electorate, and sort of they're, for lack of a better word, they're kind of academically arguing about a better United States, but they don't really have the pressures of implementing it, right?
Yes, that's most definitely true. And it's also to them, on the eve of the Civil War in January 1860, it's not only academic but theoretical
Well,
because
yeah.
most of them don't believe that abolition, the end of slavery, is going to happen in the lives of their grandchildren, much less during their own lives. So it is an entirely theoretical, you know,
Yeah.
construction to try and understand how we're going to perfect the Union. Uh, and as a consequence of that, because they don't, right. So you mentioned Garrison's Declaration of Sentiments. That was,
Hmm.
one of the manifesto kind of when he founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. And in it, he essentially lays out the two main goals of the abolitionist movement. We want immediate emancipation, and we
Hmm.
want rights for African Americans. Again, he doesn't specify what rights those are, but those are the two goals, right? Emancipation and post-emancipation Black rights. But the fact that they don't expect emancipation to occur in their lifetimes means most of them haven't really thought about the post-emancipation issue,
Right.
right? Because they
Right.
don't need to. If emancipation is 50 years away, well,
Right.
it's just a far off problem that our children can think about. And
Right.
there are exceptions. People like Frederick Douglass and Wendell Phillips were talking
Hmm.
about it well before the Civil War, but
Yeah.
people like Garrison were not. They hadn't really thought about it in detail, and this becomes problematic when the war forces them to think about it because it reveals that they're all united, they all want immediate emancipation, but beyond that, they actually
Yeah.
have quite a bit of differences that have been masked up to that point.
Yeah. That was another question for later too that I want to explore a little bit with you. And yeah, the Declaration of Sentiments will come back as well.
Sure.
Some thoughts on that. But let's talk about the historiography because you already mentioned James McPherson, and you have him in a few places in your book. But I also noticed you mentioned a few times Kate Macer, and then also what's his first name here? Stephen Oakes uh, works.
James Oaks.
James Oakes. Sorry, yes, James Oakes. I interviewed him. Gosh, 2 years ago when his new book on the anti-slavery
Mm-hmm.
constitution came out.
Mm-hmm.
And I found it really refreshing because you kind of like they're all a lot of scholars these days have said like Lincoln was like even if he didn't say it, if he didn't kind of his actions didn't present that he was anti-slavery, but you came to seem to indicate that especially the abolitionists when they looked at Lincoln's actions, they were like, no, this man is not anti-slavery. He is everything but that. Do you do you feel like these other historians have overstepped sort of the evidence, or is it that when we look at the perceptions of abolitionists, that's just how Lincoln came off? What how would you think of this, like the debates that you're kind of creating with these other scholars?
Yeah. I mean, their books, I mean, James Oakes's new book is they're fantastic. I mean, they're
I
just
agree.
really landmark and important pieces. Kate Mazur's scholarship as well. Uh, I do enter into a healthy debate with them, but I don't think there's anything in terms of overstepping. I think we just have different interpretations of Lincoln.
Hmm.
Uh, that is one of the main things historiographically that I'm involved in.
Hmm.
Um, One of the three things. I mean, the others are that there's a lot. I mentioned this a bit earlier. There's a lot of books on of scholarship on abolitionism, but most don't get into the Civil War years. They kind of just focus on Lincoln and the Republicans, and not so much on the abolitionists during the war years. And
Hmm.
I think that's a mistake. Um, and you mentioned this a bit earlier, Niels, but the few books that are written on it, uh, they kind of portray abolitionists as unalloyed success stories. And I also try to dispute that. But yeah, what you're talking about is this idea that the Lincoln administration, and Lincoln in particular, had these very thoroughly anti-slavery motivations from the start, and were calculating to bring about emancipation from almost the start of the war, which makes the emancipation process seem kind of inexorable.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I'm not alone in trying focusing more on Lincoln as a political tactician. I mean, there are a lot of
Mm-hmm.
historians who are doing this:
True.
Richard Carradine, Paul Escott,
Mm-hmm.
Daniel Crofts. I've looked
Yeah.
at Lincoln as someone who is personally anti-slavery, but is above all a political strategist and a tactician
Mm-hmm.
who understands his goal is to uphold the Constitution and to only move when public sentiment and
Mm-hmm.
the political capital within his party allows him to do so. And he's not going to do so either until
Yeah.
it becomes clear that moving against slavery will help preserve the Constitution and win the
Mm-hmm.
war. That doesn't mean that he was not anti-slavery. Personally, he was, but
Right.
he understood his
The
role as the
limits.
defender of the Constitution and commander in
Yeah.
chief of the army. It was and as the political leader of the Republican Party, because as a politician, his goal is to maintain popularity and win re-election. That is
Yeah.
not changed
No.
in over 150 years.
Well, yeah.
So,
And I
so
think
I,
that's sort of the dilemma we are facing with Lincoln of like how like he like I think you say that very frequently going back to your roots of Jefferson, right? You can turn Jefferson into pretty much anything you want because he has said something about any subject matter. Like I think it was in a religion book that you can turn Jefferson into anything, just not into a religious man or a Christian. And that sort of applies with Lincoln too, that he has sort of this like he's a politician. He has to be very cautious about the things he does and maneuver the landscapes that he is facing politically.
yeah.
Um,
Um, I will say, like, and I actually this idea comes from originally from one of James Oakes's earlier books, The Radical and the
mm,
Republican, like the how Lincoln in the later years of the war evinces this moral growth and really becomes not only just for political reasons a defender of emancipation and eventually black rights, but really is morally dedicated to it in the later years of
mhm,
the that is
right.
certainly something I subscribe to. But I do regarding whether I think Lincoln, what his actual motivations were, or whether it's just abolitionist perceptions. I do agree with the abolitionists when they talk about early in the war, essentially that
Mhm,
the war was not a war against slavery and would not become a war against slavery
right.
unless they got involved. Right? It was
Hmm.
the so I mean we'll probably talk about this a little later, but it was the interventionists, these people who had
Hmm.
warmed a bit to the Republicans, Garrison, Phillips, Douglas, who said essentially is yeah, it's not going to become an abolition war unless we make it so, unless we get involved and help turn the tide and convince, raise the tide of public opinion, garner political capital, and help Lincoln see that it's it's politically feasible to do this, as
Hmm.
well as a necessary measure to win the war. So I do think that they're correct in that respect, and they did play an essential role in making emancipation happen. So I don't think they were just blowing things out of proportion there. They definitely blow things out of proportion regarding Lincoln later on, like during the election of 1864.
We'll get there.
They're not totally rational all the time, but
Yeah.
but yeah, I think their assessment of the landscape, the political landscape, and at the start of the war in April 1861 is pretty accurate.
Yeah. Well, I I I personally think that too, based on sort of my reading of sayings, but I'm glad we're in agreement on that. The other parts that I kind of want to change direction before we get into Garrison and the politics is that I was really stuck. I mean, I always knew sort of like there's this very strong religious aspect with regard to the moralism and the
Yep.
underpinnings of abolition and some of its most important leadership. But then you had these like two words or two phrases really that struck out to me. Like there was in one case I think one of the abolitionists called it American Armageddon that was going on, and another one called it sort of a fight for the beacon of democracy. And um, having just finished a book on the United States, sort of countering the exceptionalist narrative of the United States myself, was a co-author. Um, those terms really stuck sort of as exceptionalists. That the abolitionists sort of think like, oh, the United States needs us to save it and save its like its soul, so that it can be for the world sort of this shiny city on the hill. Um, and it struck me odd and weird because abolitionism is this very transatlantic movement with its close ties between American abolitionists, U.S. abolitionists, and British abolitionists. So it's like, uh, can you clarify it a little bit for me? Are they
No,
kind of
it
just in
certainly
this?
is. Yeah, yeah. It certainly, sorry. Yeah, but it certainly is weird and paradoxical. And also because, I mean, there are abolitionists who are actual, preachers and clergymen who have for years before the Civil War said Garrison was just this, anti-religious heretic. But all of them subscribe to these same views.
Right.
So essentially, Garrison was against organized religion, but all of these people had a deep sense of spiritualism and of providentialism and
Mm-hmm.
of American exceptionalism.
Right.
So the idea was that the United States was divinely ordained by
Mm-hmm.
God. This is, Protestant millenarian tones
Right.
all the way, grounded in revivalism, all that. Uh, God had ordained the United States as this beacon of democracies for the world to light the way and fight the forces of oppression in Europe and the old world. And the Declaration of Independence embodied this promise, but in the years after 1776, it became corrupted. It lost its way,
Mm-hmm.
and they had to restore it so that it could attain its true mantle, its true destiny as this beacon of democracy. Uh, so that's that term. American Armageddon. So these interventionists, uh, when they became frustrated in the 1850s, they began to believe that there needed to be some sort of that there was some sort of divine wrath coming,
Mm-hmm.
some sort of providential reckoning, and that this apocalyptic moment, this Armageddon, would be necessary to really wake up the Union out of its stupor and to really like create this cleansing, purifying revolution that would end in a morally transformed Union.
Mm-hmm.
They referred to it as American Armageddon, as apocalypse, but most often they referred to it as what they called their golden moment. So
Mm-hmm.
these interventionists were looking for this golden moment. And when the war started in April 1861, they thought an abolition war would be that golden moment. If we can
Right.
just get if we could just get emancipation to become a Union war aim, that'll create that revolution. That'll sweep away slavery and racial prejudice, and it will
Mm.
create moral paradise, and everything will be great. Obviously, a little,
Right.
not not totally accurate there,
Right.
but that was what they meant by
Mm.
American Armageddon. And it is paradoxical because there are a lot of British abolitionists and Irish
Yeah.
abolitionists, people like George Thompson, Richard
Yeah.
Davis Webb, who were part of the abolitionist movement. It was transatlantic, and they also believed in this idea of American exceptionalism. It doesn't mean that they were, view the United States as more important than Britain. I mean, George Thompson was an
I
MP,
don't
John
know.
Bright was an MP, but they did believe that the United States held great promise and it could be at the forefront of a wave of liberalization in Europe,
Mm.
hopefully alongside Great Britain after, various reforms that were passed and the American abolitionists were supported them, Chartism,
Right.
various other things in the 1830s and 40s. But yeah, the it was a bit confusing to me, and I didn't really expect to see that these British and Irish abolitionists subscribe to this American
Right.
exceptionalism, but I mean they did. I In my book I include a quote from one of them, an MP, radical, abolitionist named John Bright, who said, "We know what your great free republic means on your continent and also in Europe, and that the extension of freedom with you would also do its extension here." Right. So
Right.
they firmly subscribe to this idea that if the United States became this morally transformed union, it would help Britain
Right.
and Europe as well.
And I mean, we like my co-author Duncan Campbell would he has a very low opinion of Pride and Compton, but on both sides, right? Like abolitionists in the United States and Britain, we're not talking large groups. We're talking about a small number of people that are,
Extremely small.
yeah, that are just very active, very much out there in the public light, and that draw more attention than their numbers ever justify. But in at least the U.S. case, successfully. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I've sometimes been asked to like put like a number, a percentage of how many people are abolitionists, and I have no idea, but not a lot
yeah.
is the answer. Not a lot.
Yeah, gosh, I think my you're taking me back to like my undergrad. I think my history teacher in Civil War history was trying to give us numbers and just was like, it's super small, and I don't remember the percentage he tried to attach.
It's not a
It
lot.
it isn't. But
It is one of the fascinating things. Not to go off on a too far, but after the war, after emancipation is
Mhm.
achieved, and being an abolitionist is popular, pretty much everyone who said that who had either been an abolitionist or had just gone to like one anti-slavery meeting for five
Yeah,
minutes said that they
right.
were an abolitionist and had led the charge against slavery. So suddenly everyone was an abolitionist. But when it was actually unpopular, when they were actually being attacked by mobs,
No
and
one was.
no, pretty much no one was. Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of like the American Revolution, right? After the revolution, everyone is a patriot, but when it starts, it's not. And like everyone is a whatever football team goes to the Super Bowl fan for for that couple hours. And before that,
It's a pretty common thing. And it's
yeah,
also I've seen, like after a presidential election,
yeah,
like 2/3 of people said they voted for the winning candidate.
yeah. And you're
Generally.
like, how's that possible?
Yeah.
But yes, that's a perfect segue over into politics, because most of your book revolves around politics. And um, one of the big challenges that you are chronicling in the book is that should abolitionists get involved in politics or not? And let's just stick with that for the first part, because there's a lot of layers that we kind of have to peel back when it comes to the political involvement. But um, why or why not should they engage and
Hmm.
how in politics?
Yeah. So we'll talk more later about the divide between interventionists and moral purists. So just
Hmm.
say moral purists definitely didn't want to get involved and were very upset that other people did want to get involved. But the interventionists, and again, abolitionists, not a large group, but of this small group, the vast majority of abolitionists in the United States are interventionists.
Hmm.
Garrison, Phillips, Douglas, other names I talk about in my book, like Moncure Conway, Lydia Maria Child, George Cheever, both Garrisonians and non-Garrisonians. Um, these people are really facing an outbreak dilemma at the outbreak of war after the fall of Fort Sumter in April 1861, because they understand that this war is a real opportunity to achieve emancipation. The North is
Hmm.
at the Union is at war with Confederacy. Most of the northern states are at war with most of the southern states.
Hmm.
So if we can somehow turn this into a war for emancipation, again, it would be a golden moment. We might achieve all our goals. Um, but Lincoln is not really helping with that. They think it's their job to help turn the tide of public
Hmm.
and political opinion. They have to do it. But the question is how to do so, right? Their tactics of the last 30 years have not been working, right? People are not listening to them. So how to get people to listen? And the only way, and they kind of hit on this because of what they saw Benjamin Butler doing at Fort Monroe, where he was taking
Hmm.
in fugitive slaves and declaring them contraband of war, and essentially couching anti-slavery action in the language of expediency. Uh,
Hmm.
that made abolitionists realize they had to overhaul their entire strategies, and in sense their entire senses of being to transform the abolitionist movement from a kind of moral reform movement into a political interest group. They had to start appealing to the North uh, through these innovative arguments that didn't present emancipation just as an act of justice, but as an act of expediency, to appeal to
Hmm.
Northerners in their own language and say emancipation is a necessity to win the war. And not only that, but we have an easy way to do it, the War Powers Clause of the U.S. Constitution.
Hmm.
And this is, again, a pretty astounding turnaround for these abolitionists, especially for these Garrisonians like William Lloyd Garrison, who had viewed the Constitution as pro-slavery, right? Like
Yeah.
5 years
Yeah.
earlier, Garrison had burned the Constitution on stage at an abolitionist gathering at the Fourth of July gathering, and now all of a sudden he's publishing pamphlets and other things saying we should use this clause of the U.S. Constitution as our
Yeah.
instrument to end slavery. It's a pretty remarkable and astonishing turnaround. And not only that, not only should we be totally changing our messaging, but we should also be descending from our, from the high aloof clouds and aligning with mainstream political parties, with people who
Hmm.
are morally beneath us, who are in the halls of power, so that they could spread our message and it can gain popularity.
Yeah.
And again, this was a really difficult thing to do, but
Mm.
for example, Wendell Phillips gave a speech in April 1861 in Boston, and right after the fall of Fort Sumter. A few weeks earlier, he had been decrying the Union as evil and pro-slavery. Now, all of a sudden, uh, the Union's at war. Lincoln has called for troops. Everyone's rallying into Union blue. Abolitionists
Mm.
had not really expected this, but they see it happening and they adjust and they adapt.
Right.
And Phillips essentially is about to give this big speech. And he talks to his confidant, his future son-in-law, before and says, am I really about to, renounce my entire past, my past 30 years, and totally change my identity? And he does. He goes
Mm.
out on a stage that's covered in American flags and says, I support the Union War.
Right.
Stand with President Lincoln, and we must defeat the rebels. So he really does. It really does change everything. But there is a risk to that. And the reason, partly why Phillips was so worried, and that these worries continue in these interventionists throughout the first years of the war, is that they're descending into the muck, right? They're descending from
Hmm.
their Olympian heights. They
Yeah.
view themselves as saints, right? They believed they were on these Olympian heights of purity, regardless if it's true or not, and they would have to descend into the muck. But in a more practical and real sense, they would have to risk their radical values by allying with politicians who did not share those values, right? And the
Hmm.
risk of doing that is that you might just become satisfied, complacent in this political mainstream and lose sight of some of your more radical goals and values, the things that were less expedient and less accepted by the
Mm.
politicians. And that really did create this kind of palpable anxiety and anguish that these interventionists felt throughout the first years of the war. They were trying to balance their personal moral ideals, which hadn't changed, right? They still had the same goals: emancipation, post-emancipation, black rights. And they're trying to balance that with the necessities of pressure politics, with
Right.
publicly talking about how great Lincoln is, with talking about expediency and not justice. Uh, and it really created essentially a total split between what these abolitionists would say in public
Mm.
and what they would believe and say in private in their own letters to each other in their diaries regarding Lincoln. I mean, in
Yeah.
public, people like Garrison and Phillips would talk about how, Lincoln was great and they totally supported him. And in private, uh, they said various things, including that he was a pro-slavery puppet, that he was an imbecile, that he was evil.
Right.
It
Yeah.
was just
Yeah.
ran the gamut. Some of them are contradictory because one person, he can't be
And
both a puppet and evil mastermind.
well,
But
there's you kind of it's almost like it sounds like, oh, like was one of your people like a few weeks earlier you criticized and now you're standing and you're fully embracing it. You could be called hypocritical in like what you're doing. That like what's your true identity? Are you just or like yeah?
yeah, I
Is
mean
this just convenient for you right now to do?
they essentially understood, and I think correctly, that was like supporting the war was a means to an end. It was
Hmm.
not like their end. This is a thing I also engage in terms of scholarship. Their end was not just, emancipation and black rights. They wanted to save the Union, right? In a moral
Hmm.
sense, they wanted in a providential sense, and they believed this was the way to do it. So we just have to muffle our private and personal qualms and just stand with the war because we can better harness it and we can better turn and steer Lincoln toward emancipation from the inside than from the outside. You're
Hmm.
not going to achieve anything at this point as a gadfly. You have to work from the inside. And I think that was a pretty, practical and pragmatic understanding, which isn't something that we see often when historians talk about abolitionists. They're often depicted as just these high-minded idealists with their heads in the
Hmm.
clouds. These people were dynamic strategists, and they understood that they had to change, and they did. And I think they
Hmm.
did so to great effect.
So I will complicate now because one of
Mhm.
the interesting parts too that you mention in your book is that they then go into an alliance with the radical Republicans,
Yeah.
and they see a lot of similarities, especially as the war emerges, and you very clearly note that radical Republicans and abolitionists are not the same. And Charles Sumner is sort of your example in that regard. Um, but it's really interesting to see this evolution throughout the book, where you kind of start. This is sort of an alliance they're building. They're um, the the abolitionists are good to kind of give um, a are using these radical Republicans to kind of get publicity out, and then it turns, and the abolitionists are the ones that pull along the radical Republicans, and then you get to the point where it turns again, and the clear it felt like the clear situation emerges that this is for radical Republicans seemed like it was just a alliance of convenience for them rather than an ideological like we're on the same page situation.
I think it was in many ways an alliance of convenience, but there were a lot of ideological similarities. So again,
Sure.
radical Republicans shared with abolitionists belief in immediate emancipation and black rights. Like I'm not
Mm-hmm.
questioning at all that people like Charles Sumner wanted black
Yeah.
equality and Thaddeus Stevens. They did. But
Mm-hmm.
they were also part of this mainstream political party, and had to adhere to its dictates.
Mm-hmm.
And as politicians, they followed the political headwinds wherever it went. So,
Mm-hmm.
only when things were politically feasible and palatable would they take that ground in a lot of
Right.
cases. And that was a big that did make abolitionists sometimes not allies of convenience when things were less feasible
Right.
and palatable. So yeah, I talk about after the first Bull Run in July 1861, the abolitionists had created this alliance. They this what I call an anti-slavery alliance. They bridged the gaps between people like Garrison and Frederick Douglass within the abolitionists, but they realize they have to reach out further, and they reach out to radical Republicans, and they do
Mm-hmm.
work together. And at first, yeah, it's the radical Republicans are the guys in the positions of power. So abolitionists used radical Republicans to spread their ideas, and to great effect. I
Yeah.
mean, probably the biggest example I talk about in my book is Moncure Conway, this really
Mm-hmm.
fascinating
It was
figure who
fascinating.
hopefully get a chance to talk about him later. He, with Wendell Phillips's help, reaches out to Charles Sumner and says, "I'm trying to write a book, but the publishers don't want me. Could you put in a good word?" And Charles Sumner essentially engineers it, totally steers it to publication
Mm-hmm.
with the press, and helps him, and yeah, really guiding light in getting the book published. Um, and that's in the fall of 1861. But as abolitionist arguments and alliances catch on, the war is going on without an end in sight, and more people are getting wary and are just looking for anything. What can accelerate Union victory and bring
Mm-hmm.
our sons and brothers and fathers home? Uh, and so the abolitionists' arguments, as spread by their political allies, become really popular, and
Mm-hmm.
something that no one expected to see happen. These abolitionists become celebrities. William Lloyd
Yeah.
Garrison, the guy who was chased by a mob a few years earlier, all of a sudden is now speaking to adoring crowds.
Yeah.
Frederick Douglass, too.
They
Wendell
come to
Phillips,
Washington, right?
yeah,
They're invited to speak in
Wendell
Washington.
Phillips and Moncure Conway and another guy, George Cheever, are invited to speak in a lecture series at the Smithsonian and then speak on the floor of Congress
Yeah.
and meet Lincoln at the White House. I mean, it's a really astonishing turnaround. Uh, But as a result, radical Republicans realize, it's not the kind of balance, the dynamics of power in this relationship shift, because they
Mm-hmm.
realize, wait a minute, we should latch on to the abolitionist celebrity, not the other way around. We
Yeah.
should ask, hey, I just gave a speech on the floor of the Senate. Could you please publish it in your
Yeah.
abolitionist newspaper? Could you please come campaign for us? Which
Yeah.
actually happens.
Yeah.
George Cheever, who I mentioned a bit earlier, he's a Congregationalist preacher uh, from New York, and Republicans in Pennsylvania actually asked him to come and speak in the Pennsylvania, state legislature,
Hmm.
help bolster embattled Republicans in their electoral fight and come help them out.
Hmm.
And other Republicans ask a new star on the scene, Anna Dickinson from Pennsylvania, really
Hmm.
young firebrand abolitionist, to come help out in elections in New Hampshire, in
Hmm.
Connecticut, and other places to help the Republicans. So suddenly, abolitionists are like prized political assets, and that's
Celebrities almost, right?
yeah, it's insane. But essentially, not to cut things too short, but the abolitionists, this alliance works, and abolitionists, these interventionists really do help push the level of public sentiment and political
Mhm.
sentiment for emancipation up and do help achieve the Emancipation Proclamation. But there's not much of a public appetite to go beyond that. And
Mhm.
so radical Republicans initially, in the early months of 1863 especially, are not, for all of their strongly anti-slavery and egalitarian beliefs, aren't really looking to go further. So when these interventionists, some of them want to go further, they kind of rebuff them. And there's a lot of tension. I mean, the most famous example is there's an abolitionist, talk about in my book, named James Miller McKim, who goes down to the Sea Islands with newly emancipated slaves and realizes we should have some type of a Freedmen's Aid Commission, something to that effect, and wants to work with Charles Sumner to do it. And Charles Sumner says, that's a great idea. They work together. McKim says, once this commission is created, I want to be the secretary. And Sumner says, yeah, sure. He doesn't hear about it for months, thinks the project's dead. He writes to a friend and saying, it's a shame this thing died. And the guy said, oh, it's not dead. I'm the new secretary of the commission. It was created the other week. So they just totally sidelined this abolitionist because they just decided it was
Yeah,
inexpedient for the time being.
yeah. It's yeah, the stories you found were fascinating in so many regards, and um, in part we don't want to give all of them away, so people actually have to
No,
buy your book.
of course.
Now I kind of want to go into the other direction because you're already kind of hinting in the direction now of the growing struggles in once Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation is in place of the next stage and what rights and will there be racial equality? And it's sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but there were parts where it felt like that your abolitionists were kind of worried that by hastening along the process of emancipation, it would also sort of undermine the cause for equality for African Americans, that going too fast, not preparing people right, could backfire on them.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that's true. I'm not sure they articulate it so much, but I do think the achievement of emancipation does lead to the collapse of the abolitionist movement and the strife over Black rights, and that leads
Hmm.
to what I call the so little in this equation of achieving so much and so
Hmm.
little, because their victory essentially begets their failure. So I talk about this division between interventionists and moral purists during the first years of the war, and to just in brief, it's a division over the means to a moral union, how to achieve it.
Hmm.
But as I mentioned earlier, the common fight for emancipation is masking these differences among a lot of abolitionists over what comes after, what do Black rights
Hmm.
after actually mean. And it turns out in the first years of the war, bubbling beneath the surface, because there's still this common fight among the interventionists, it turns out there is a pretty big difference of opinion on this. So it's not over the means to a
Right.
moral union. It's what does a moral union actually look like? What's it actually mean? And this division is among who I call narrow interventionists and broad interventionists. So narrow is
Hmm.
people like William Lloyd Garrison, especially Moncure Conway, who never really thought much about Black rights before
Yeah.
the war. As they do start to think about it, they take on a pretty restrictive sense of what it means.
Hmm.
So, things like free plantation wage labor. And then you have
Hmm.
your broad interventionists, people like Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, who have a much more expansive view. They
Right.
come to, incorporate the language of politics and believe we need full legislated equality in the
Mm.
post-war era. So full political, civil, socioeconomic equality. So again, these differences are buried initially in this common fight for emancipation, but once it's achieved, once you have to look to the post-emancipation landscape, then it comes to the fore. And this is where this warning that purists had all along about how politics can corrupt and hurt the cause. This is where it comes into play, because
Mhm.
these narrow interventionists, like Garrison especially, do become kind of swept up in mainstream politics and do
Mhm.
start to moderate their interests. So uh,
Yeah.
he obviously never, he always firmly supports immediate emancipation, but he starts to pare away this idea of Black rights at all. So,
Mhm.
by the end of the war, he's saying that post-emancipation Black rights are essentially irrelevant to the abolitionist mission. It'd be nice if they happened, but they're not part of my cause. They're not what I have to do, and they don't. They're just emancipation will make a morally transformed union, right? If we achieve
Mhm.
emancipation and the union wins, we've got a morally transformed union. I can retire. The job is done. We can pack up and go home. Whereas people like Phillips and Douglas say, like, no, uh, the mission of abolitionism is to achieve emancipation
Right.
and Black rights, which for them very clearly now means, total full equality. So that creates this massive division. Uh, the election of 1864 colors it, and there's a lot we could talk about there. But in some, Garrison declares his mission accomplished after the 13th Amendment and the Union victory, tries to disband the American Anti-Slavery Society, the leading society of abolitionism, because he says organized
We're
abolitionism
done.
is mission's over. Uh, he tries to lead a vote to disband the society and fails. But on failing, he and his followers leave. They abandon the society and retire. And in doing so, really abandon those abolitionists who do want to fight for equality, leave them without the numbers, the influence, the resources that the
Mhm.
wartime movement had, and uh, really neuters their ability to help achieve change and secure Black equality. So that is the paradox of my
Yeah.
book. Essentially, abolitionists could not have helped achieve emancipation or accomplished anything
Right.
politically without getting involved. But by doing so, they essentially ultimately obstructed their ability to achieve anything beyond.
It is when I read that, it so reminded me of like George W. Bush and his speech on the aircraft carrier of mission accomplished, Iraq war is over, and then it's 2 years of fighting that follows to stabilize the country. And it's like um but I'm glad I was gonna do that later, but we're also getting towards the end here time wise. You had this beautiful statement in your book, and I'm going to read that because I found this was just it's so on point also of what you just said. You wrote Garrison was effectively rewriting his declaration of sentiments, which had made Black inclusion a concurrent and co-equal demand of abolitionism alongside emancipation. Now he expunged it from his agenda, past and present, especially singling out the idea of Black suffrage. I mean, it just it. I thought that totally encapsulated exactly what you're just saying. That um, Garrison, the leading voice, the lightning rod of the abolitionist movement, all of a sudden is like, mission accomplished. We're done. Let's go home
Mhm,
and let's
mhm.
let let the freedmen worry for themselves about their future. Like it it so seems like the uh, if you believe in Reconstruction as a failure, it seemed like that exact argument in a nutshell.
Yeah, and he he was again one of the people who never really thought too much about Black rights
Right.
before the war. So he was never one Phillips in that sense, but he had written this declaration of sentiments that had made, rights for African Americans, yeah, one of the two goals of abolitionism. And when he suddenly was saying it, he was saying at the end of the Civil War repeatedly, this was never a goal of abolitionism at all. It was just emancipation. A lot of people, Wendell Phillips, Frederick Douglass, other African American abolitionists like George Downing would constantly remind him, "You wrote this Declaration
You're,
of Sentiment that directly contradicts what you're saying right now."
yeah,
And
it's an
so, uh,
uncomfortable moment right there.
yeah, I think partly, I mean, Garrison certainly did not see it as a betrayal in any sense. I
Right.
mean, he had been fighting for 30 years, and he was, I mean, all these people were incredibly egotistical, but this is an idea that I actually got from one of my mentors, James Brewer Stewart, that he essentially saw his own personal struggles and foibles as pretty much uh, the embodiment, the manifestation of the abolitionist movement. So the fact that
Mm,
he personally became popular and triumphant and was in fact invited in April 1865 to the ceremony re-raising the federal flag at Fort
mhm.
Sumter, which I mean, the symbolism of that,
It's big.
he's invited to a ceremony in the cradle of secession, like this radical abolitionist. He sees like the fact that he has personally triumphed as signifying
Mhm.
the triumph of the abolitionist movement. Like there are massive blind spots in that, and everyone pointed it out, and it was like an abandonment.
Yeah,
But he certainly did not see himself as a
right.
betrayal.
I mean, I kind of like as you're talking, I kind of was thinking I met when I saw Nick Saban at Alabama retired recently, and I wrote a friend. I was like, oh, so he retired, so he doesn't have to deal with Texas and University of Oklahoma in the future, and it's sort of like, oh, it's over. I kind of never lost. Like never had to worry about the big games that went away from me, and it sounds like Garrison is somewhat like that here in the moments that like he has accomplished one of his goals, emancipation. Now there's still like the whole what do you do with the rights of the freedman? And that would be another 20 or 30 years of struggle. And he's probably tired of like I can say I accomplished one goal, I'm done.
He absolutely is tired. But instead of, you know, supporting at least from afar the continued rump abolitionist
Yeah.
movement, he just
But
totally denigrates it again and again, says like they're our mission's over, this is irrelevant, and spends quite a bit of time trying to burnish his own legacy. I won't reveal all of the stuff, but there's some pretty juicy stuff
yeah,
that he says
yeah,
as he tries to talk about how his own legacy in history.
yeah. So very briefly, since we're almost at an hour mark by this point, 1864 election and what I guess we can call abolitionists shooting themselves for the struggle for civil rights for African Americans, because that it was a fascinating chapter. I had briefly looked at it in my own book, Liberty and Slavery, because of some Germans that were involved in this Cleveland movement, but it seems like everything went wrong.
Yeah. So I don't want to get too into the weeds of all the differences and stuff. Uh, so essentially, during the first years of the war up to the Emancipation Proclamation, the division is between interventionists and moral purists. Uh, when you get to the end of the war, by the very end, when you're fighting over whether the anti-slavery societies should continue, you've got on one side narrow interventionists who don't want it to, like Garrison. On the
Mm,
other side, you got broad interventionists like Phillips and Douglas, who have joined with moral purists like Barker Pillsbury and Abby Kelly Foster. They pretty much are on the same page at this point and saying, yeah, we're okay with using, some sort of political activism, but we want full equality. And so they're on the side of continuation.
mm,
Uh, in the middle, it becomes a bit muddled and confusing, but just in broad strokes, narrow interventionists over the course of 1863-64, like Garrison, come to see Lincoln as the embodiment of their goals of Union victory and total
right.
emancipation. Uh, and they're moderated goals, I should say.
Mm,
In some ways, maybe going in opposite directions from Lincoln as he moves toward black rights, they're pairing it off.
mhm,
Uh, and they become essentially partisans for Lincoln in the 1864 election, full-fledged partisans engaging in politicking. Garrison actually attends Lincoln's renomination convention at Baltimore in
yeah.
1864 and goes to meet Lincoln at the White House after. Whereas broad interventionists and moral purists uh, increasingly come to see Lincoln as an obstacle to
Mhm,
their goal of post-emancipation black rights. And again, for them, that means specifically equality.
yeah.
Uh, and by the end of 1863, the interventionist camp collapses in spectacular fashion. Garrison and Phillips, lifelong friends and key allies during the years of the war, become bitter enemies.
Mhm,
Um, Garrison leads the pro-Lincoln camp, the pro-Lincoln partisans who are mostly narrow interventionists. There are some exceptions. Again, I don't want to bog down too much here. And Phillips leads the anti-Lincoln camp, which again, mostly narrow interventionists and moral purists. There are some exceptions, and they engage in really,
It's
heavy-handed.
nasty.
It's really nasty politicking.
You call it even
Garrison,
a civil war that's like
yeah,
happening. So
it's
it's
a
like
civil war
it's
within the
yeah,
abolitionists.
yeah.
So Garrison essentially starts defending Lincoln administration officials like Montgomery Blair, who have a very checkered record on rights for African
Oh
Americans,
yeah.
to say the least,
You had some
and
good
just total.
statements on that.
Yeah. Whereas Phillips, uh, Parker Pillsbury, Abby Kelly Foster, George Cheever, and briefly Frederick Douglass try to find an alternative candidate to take on Lincoln to become the
Mhm.
Republican nominee. They eventually hit on, they look at Benjamin Butler, for example. They eventually hit on John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, the 1856 Republican nominee, had issued an Emancipation Edict in Missouri in 1861. Very politically opportunistic, ambitious guy.
Mhm.
They think he can be the Republican nominee. Turns out he can't. And so Fremont essentially engineers his movement into a third party. Um, I call it the Cleveland movement. Its formal name was the Radical Democracy Party, but they had their
Very
convention
bad
in
title
Cleveland.
too.
Yeah, they had their convention at Cleveland, so just for shorthand, I refer to it as the Cleveland movement. Phillips and very brief and all these guys and briefly Douglas support it because at first it appeals to high-minded ideals. They talk about things like equality and appealing to abolitionists, but it becomes clear soon enough they're not getting enough sway that way. So they go the totally opposite direction and start appealing to Copperhead Democrats by talking about
And then it's
Lincoln's, violations of civil liberties,
and that's
and,
lights out.
and recruit a number of Democrats into the party. Douglas says, I want nothing to do with this anymore, wisely, and backs away. But
Mhm.
Phillips and the others stay in. Not only stay in and defend Fremont all the way to the hilt, they start saying maybe we should just openly ally with Copperhead Democrats because Lincoln is the great evil, right? They've lost. They've never, Phillips and Pillsbury and others have never diluted their goals, right? They still want total equality, but they've become a bit myopic and short-sighted. I mean, more than a bit in this moment, saying, becoming obsessed with defeating Lincoln, saying, like, the only way
Mhm.
we'll get these goals is to get rid of Lincoln. So we have to do whatever is necessary, and even aligning with these people who are pro-slavery. And this really, really damages their reputations,
Mhm.
especially of Phillips. So the biggest example is William Lloyd Garrison had many sons. One of them was named Wendell Phillips Garrison, obviously named after his friend Wendell Phillips. And Wendell Phillips is kind of, I mean, not in a formal sense, but is informally his kind of godfather. He pays
Mhm.
his namesake's way through Harvard, offers him advice throughout his life. And Wendell Phillips Garrison essentially writes to Wendell Phillips in the middle of the election and says, I mean, to paraphrase, I'm ashamed to be named after you. So it's
It's
really,
bad.
really damages its reputation. That's again part of the reason of why abolitionists fail during Reconstruction. I mean, the
Yeah.
biggest reason is because Garrison is gone and has stripped them of their resources. But the people who are left, like Phillips, really have, kind of tarnished the reputations and they're influenced by what they
Mhm.
did during the election, and that also plays a role.
Wonderful. There's so much great stuff in your book, Frank. It's incredible. So, um, with that, if you are interested in Frank's book after this, The Abolitionist Civil War, Immediatist and the Struggle to Transform the Union, it's available with LSU Press and a lot of other booksellers if you're wanting to go with some independent sellers. It was a great pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thank you so much for joining me, Frank. And I look forward to see what you come up with abolitionist memory in the future at some point.
Thanks, Nielsen. Thanks for having me.